My name is Trevor Walcott. I'm 64 years old, and for 12 years, 3 months, and 14 days, I paid the mortgage on a house that was never supposed to become a battleground. The day it finally became one was Thanksgiving. The table was full. My son was there. His wife was there. Her parents were there. A couple of their friends were there. The turkey had just been carved. The candles were still burning, and my daughter-in-law, Melissa, looked me straight in the eye, slid a white envelope across the turkey platter, and set it down in front of me as if she were serving one more side dish. I picked up the envelope. I read the first line, then the second. It was an eviction notice, printed, dated, and complete with a move-out deadline 30 days away. Melissa told me it was time I found my own place. She said it in the calm voice people use when they are certain they have already won. I did not answer right away. I only looked at her. Then I looked at my son. To understand what happened next, I have to take you back 12 years, to the day I signed my name on that deed, because that signature was the whole story. Melissa just did not know it yet. That envelope did not come from nowhere. My silence did not come from nowhere either. Both of them had been building for a very long time. I spent 31 years doing maintenance and repair work at a manufacturing plant outside Columbus. It was not glamorous work. It was hot in the summer, loud all year, and rough on the body in ways that showed up slowly. It was the kind of job where I came home, and my hands told the story of the day before I ever opened my mouth. My wife, Sandra, never complained about it. Every morning, she packed the same lunch for me. Turkey, on whole wheat, an apple, a small thermos of coffee. Then she kissed me on the cheek before I left. Sandra died 5 years ago from ovarian cancer. 18 months passed from the diagnosis to the end. The last thing she said to me, not her very last words, but the last thing she said that I knew came from the deepest part of her, was that I had to make sure Daniel had a place to land. That was the kind of woman she was. She was dying, and she was still worried about someone else having a roof over his head. When Daniel was 26 and newly married to Melissa, they could not afford a house. He had $34,000 in student loans, a credit score in the low 600s, and a decent job that had not existed long enough to satisfy a bank. A mortgage officer was not going to approve him. I had the savings. I had no debt. I had the kind of credit score that made loan officers smile. So I bought the house. My name was on the deed. My name was on the mortgage. The understanding between Daniel and me, never written down because I trusted my son, was that once his loans were cleared and he was on steadier ground, we would look at transferring ownership. He never paid the loans off. Life got in the way. I never pushed, because the arrangement was working, and Sandra's voice in the back of my mind was satisfied. In the corner of the backyard, there was a small garden Sandra planted during that first spring, roses along the fence, lavender in front of the porch. Every year, I kept them alive. That garden was still there, and to me, that was the part that mattered most. Melissa was charming when she and Daniel first married. She was smart, organized, and good at walking into a room and reading it. She brought wine when she came to dinner. She asked about my work stories. For the first couple of years, I genuinely liked her. Then Lily was born, and something shifted slowly, the way ice forms on a window. At first, I did not notice the cold spreading. Then one day, the glass was opaque. The garage code was the first thing. Melissa had it changed for security, she said, and on the surface that sounded reasonable. The problem was that no one gave me the new code. I found out one Saturday when I drove over and had to knock on the front door of the house whose mortgage came out of my bank account every month. The second thing was Lily's 4th birthday. I bought a present. I had the date circled on my calendar. That morning, Melissa called and told me I should stay home because the party was turning out smaller than expected, and she did not want to overwhelm Lily. 2 weeks later, I found out from Daniel that 30 people had been there. The third thing came through my neighbor Gary. He had run into one of the couples from down the block, people Sandra and I had known for years. Apparently, Melissa had told people more than once that I was staying with them while I got back on my feet, as if the mortgage coming out of my account every month was a small detail she had forgotten to mention. Every time I brought any of it up to Daniel, he gave me the same answer. He told me Melissa did not mean it that way. He told me I was reading into things. Maybe I was. I wanted to believe I was. Then came the morning I sat down at the family computer to print a photo of Lily and found something on the screen I was never supposed to see. The screen was open to an email from a bank. The subject line was about a home equity line of credit application status. I almost clicked away. Then I saw my name in the body of the email. Co-applicant, Trevor Walcott. I sat down and read the whole email. Melissa had submitted an application for an $80,000 home equity line of credit. She had listed herself as the primary applicant and me as the co-signer. The bank had reviewed the application and declined it, not because of her credit, but because when they pulled the deed, the property was listed solely under my name. The application did not match the ownership record. I read the email twice, then I printed it. Whether she had forged my signature directly or used my name in some other way, I knew one thing for certain. I had not authorized it. Then I thought about the blank form she had handed me 8 months earlier. She had told me it was just a permit application for the deck renovation. I had signed where she pointed, but before I handed it back, I took a picture of it on my phone because the bottom section was empty and something felt wrong. I had not thought much about it after that. Now I could not stop thinking about it. I did not confront her that day. I went home, sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes, and called Gary. I asked if he still had the paperwork from when I bought the house. He told me he did. In fact, he had more than I expected. He had been the witness on the original purchase agreement, and the real estate attorney's office had sent him a copy at closing. He had the whole file scanned and saved. I told him to hold on to it and promised I would explain later. People ask why I did not simply move out. They ask why any of this mattered enough for me to stand my ground. I will try to answer that. The roses along the back fence were planted by Sandra the spring after we closed on the house. She drove 40 minutes each way to a nursery in Westerville because they carried a variety she had seen in a magazine. Climbing roses, pale pink, the kind that come back every year if you deadhead them properly. I had deadheaded them every August since she passed. My bedroom, the small one off the hallway, the one Melissa called the guest room even though I had slept in it for 4 years, had 3 photographs on the dresser. Sandra on our wedding day, Sandra and Daniel at his college graduation. A letter Sandra wrote me during her last month in the hospital, when her handwriting had become shaky, but she still managed 2 full pages. I also had my father's watch in the nightstand drawer. It was not worth anything to a pawn shop, but it was worth everything to me. If Melissa had refinanced or sold that house, and I believe she would have once she had the equity and the legal footing, none of those things would have survived the transaction. Not because they would have been destroyed on purpose, but because they would have been inconvenient. People pack quickly when they are moving on. I never told Daniel all of that. I do not think I could have said it without my voice giving out, and I was not willing to give Melissa that, even secondhand. Instead, I wrote it in a journal I kept in my nightstand beside the watch. That night, after finding the email and calling Gary, I opened the journal and wrote 1 sentence. I am not leaving this house. I gave it 2 days. Then I asked Daniel to meet me for coffee, not at the house, but at the diner on Route 40, where we used to go on Saturdays when he was in high school. He arrived in his work clothes, still wearing his jacket. He looked tired. I ordered 2 coffees and did not say anything until they came. Then I slid the printed email across the table. He read it and did not look up right away. I told him my name was on that application and that I had not signed anything. He told me Melissa had only been looking into options. He finally looked at me and said she had not gone through with it. I reminded him that the bank turning it down was not the same thing as her choosing not to go through with it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me I could not keep assuming the worst about her. I told him I was not assuming anything. I was reading a document. He asked if I had even asked her about it. I told him I was asking him, and I asked whether he had known about it. He looked out the window for a long time before he said no. I believed him. Daniel is a bad liar, and always has been. But I also knew that before he finished his coffee, he would go home and tell Melissa everything I had said. I folded the email, put it back in my pocket, left a 20 on the table, and walked out. That evening he called me and said Melissa was upset. He said I had blindsided her. He asked if we could all have a conversation like adults. I told him I was open to that. We never had the conversation. 2 weeks passed. Then Thanksgiving arrived, and Melissa decided she would rather skip the conversation entirely and go straight to an eviction notice. She was so sure I would not know what to do with it. What I did not know at the time, and later pieced together from Carol, from Daniel, and from one very candid text message Melissa accidentally sent to the wrong contact, was what she had been doing during those 2 weeks. She invited her parents for Thanksgiving. That part was not unusual. But she also spent a long phone call telling her mother that I was creating a toxic environment and that the living situation had become unbearable. She framed it as a mental health concern. By the time Carol arrived, her sympathies had already been loaded in Melissa's favor. Melissa had also downloaded an eviction notice template from a legal forms website. She filled in my name, Daniel's address, and a vacate date 30 days away. She had not run it by an attorney. She did not think she needed to. That Tuesday, she texted a photo of the completed form to a friend. I know this because the friend, thinking it was a different group chat, forwarded it to a mutual acquaintance who happened to know Gary. That is the thing about small towns. Information moves faster than people expect, and Melissa had never quite learned that lesson. The message said she was finally doing it, that I would freak out and leave quietly because I always did. She had read me correctly up to a point. I had always backed down before. I had always chosen peace over confrontation because the cost of confrontation felt higher than the cost of swallowing things. What she had not accounted for was that I had spent the previous 2 weeks not swallowing anything. I had called James Pelham, a real estate attorney in town who had handled 3 transactions for me over the years. I brought him the deed, the mortgage statements, the printed email from the bank, and the photo I had taken of that blank form 8 months earlier. He looked at everything, Then he looked at me and told me I was the only legal owner of that property. Full stop. I thanked him and asked him to be available the week after Thanksgiving. Pelham kept photocopies of everything. I kept the originals in a folder on the back seat of my truck. They had been there since the day I walked out of his office. Thanksgiving morning was cold and gray, the kind of November day Ohio knows how to produce. Bare trees, frost on windshields, a sky the color of old concrete. I wore my good slacks and the blue sweater Sandra had given me for Christmas 3 years before she died. I do not know why I chose it that day. Maybe I needed something of hers close to me. I had called Gary the night before, not to ask him to come, only to tell him the situation. He asked what time he should be there. I told him noon. He arrived at 11:50 with a pie from the bakery in town and shook Frank Brandt's hand like they were old friends. When I walked through the front door, Melissa was in the kitchen. She smiled and told me she was glad I could make it. She said it the way people speak to someone who is visiting, someone who does not live there. I gave a simple answer and stepped inside. Lily ran at me from the living room and nearly knocked me over. She was 6 years old and already fast. I held on to her a little longer than usual. She smelled like maple syrup. Gary and I sat at the far end of the table. At one point, he leaned toward me and quietly asked if I was doing all right. I told him I was. He asked whether I wanted him to do anything. I told him to just sit there. He nodded and cut himself a piece of the pie he had brought, even though dinner had not started yet. Gary has always operated on his own timeline. Daniel came out of the kitchen carrying the turkey on a platter. He met my eyes for a second and looked away. He knew something was coming. He just did not know what shape it would take. Melissa walked out behind him. Her hands were empty, but there was a white envelope tucked into the front pocket of her apron. I saw it before she sat down. The turkey was carved. Plates were being passed. The table was loud with the comfortable noise of a full house. Forks scraped against china. Someone asked for gravy. Lily told Frank about a butterfly she had seen at school. Then Melissa stood up. She said there was something she needed to address before we started. Her voice was pitched to Carrie. The noise died down. She reached into her apron and produced the envelope. She walked around the end of the table and placed it in front of me. No preamble. No explanation. She stepped back and waited. Lily looked up and asked what it was. I opened the envelope, took out the single folded page, and read it through twice. Notice to vacate. Property address? Our address. Occupant, Trevor R. Walcott. Vacate date, 30 days from that day. I folded the paper in half, slid it into my shirt pocket, and picked up my fork. Melissa asked if I had anything to say. Carol set her wine glass down and asked Melissa what was in the envelope. Melissa said it was just a housing arrangement we were working through, nothing for the table. Carol looked at me, then back at her daughter, and said it did not look like nothing. I put my fork down and looked across the table at Melissa. 6 adults were watching. Lily was chewing quietly. Gary was very still beside me. I told them that was not quite what it was. Melissa met my eyes. She was completely calm. That was the thing about her. She was always calm when she was certain. She said she thought it was pretty straightforward. I told her it would be, if the deed were in her name. Frank Brandt put down his knife. The table stayed quiet. Not the polite quiet of people giving someone room to speak, but the kind of quiet that means something has changed and nobody is sure yet which direction it has changed in. I kept my voice even. This was not the moment for anger. Anger would have made me look unstable, and I had spent too long being treated like someone unstable to hand her that. I told them the house had been purchased in 2012. My name was on the deed. My name was on the mortgage. I had made every payment for 12 years. Daniel tried to interrupt, but I continued. Daniel had not qualified for the loan at the time. He had student debt. His credit was not there yet. That was not a criticism. It was only what the numbers said, so I took on the mortgage. The plan had been to transfer ownership once he was on steadier financial ground. Melissa said that sounded like a family contribution, not ownership. I told her that legally speaking, it meant exactly that. Ownership. Carol looked at her daughter and asked if it was true, if my name was on the deed. Melissa said it was a formality and that we were in the process of getting it updated. I told her I had the deed in my car, along with 12 years of mortgage statements. The table shifted. 2 of Daniel's friends, Mike and Seth, exchanged a look. Frank had both hands flat on the table now, as if bracing himself. I said Gary's name. He was already pushing back his chair. He stood, nodded once to the table, and walked toward the front door. Melissa watched him go. For the first time that afternoon, something moved behind her eyes that was not certainty. Gary came back in 4 minutes. He set a manila folder on the table beside my plate. It was thick, the edges worn, the kind of folder that had been handled many times. He opened it, pulled out 3 documents, and spread them across the tablecloth. The deed. The 2012 purchase agreement. A summary page from the mortgage servicer showing 12 years of payment history with my name at the top of every line. Gary told the table he had been the witness at closing. He said if anyone needed him to confirm the signature, he would be happy to do it. Nobody said anything. Frank leaned forward and read the deed. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something when he hopes the second pass will say something different from the first. Then he sat back. Carol's voice was very quiet when she told Melissa my name was on it. Melissa said we had already discussed getting that updated and that it was only paperwork. I looked at her steadily and said I had planned to transfer ownership when Daniel was ready. That conversation had not happened. And in light of the eviction notice now sitting in my shirt pocket, I said the conversation needed to happen properly, with attorneys and something in writing. Melissa told me I was making it into something it did not need to be. Her voice had gone flat. I reminded her that she had handed me an eviction notice at Thanksgiving dinner, in front of her parents and in front of my granddaughter. I told her I had not made it into anything. Frank cleared his throat. Seth's wife had stopped eating entirely. Lily was looking between me and her mother with the focused confusion of a child trying to read a room she was not supposed to understand yet. Daniel had not said a word in 4 minutes. Then Melissa changed tactics. I had seen her do it before. When one approach stopped working, she did not simply push harder. She pivoted. Her eyes softened. Her shoulders came forward slightly. She said she was not trying to hurt anyone. She said she was trying to protect her family. Our family. She looked around the table and said they needed their own space. They needed stability. She asked whether that was so wrong. Carol started to reach for her daughter's hand, but Frank said Melissa's name firmly, though not unkindly, and told her that was not what had been in the envelope. Melissa turned to Daniel and asked him to say something. Daniel had been staring at the mortgage statement. He set it down and looked at his wife. Something in his face settled into an expression I had not seen in a long time. It was not anger exactly. It was more like clarity, the kind that comes after something has finally been said out loud after everyone has been pretending it was not true. He stood and said enough. Melissa blinked and asked what he meant. He told her again that it was enough. She accused him of taking my side. He said he was not taking sides. He was just done pretending this was a conversation about housing arrangements. The table was silent in a different way then. The way people go silent when they are witnessing something private become public against its will. Mike reached over and touched his wife's arm. Seth looked down at his plate. Melissa stood up from the table. She did not say anything else. She walked down the hallway, and the bedroom door closed behind her. It was not a slam. It was something more controlled than that, which somehow felt worse. I looked at the candles on the sideboard, still burning. The turkey had gone cold. Gary quietly helped himself to another slice of pie. Before I tell what happened after that table cleared, I want to pause on one thing. If any part of this story feels familiar, maybe you know what it is like to swallow things at family dinners for years. Maybe you know what it is like to wait for someone to finally say enough. I had been quiet for too long, and I almost did not get through the part that came next. The guest left by 7. Frank shook my hand at the door. It was a long handshake, the kind that says more than words. Carol hugged me briefly and said nothing, which told me everything. Daniel cleared the table alone, and I helped him. We did not speak. Around 8, I went to my room, the small room off the hallway, with the narrow window facing the backyard. Sandra's roses were out there in the dark, stripped down for winter, just bare canes against the fence. I knew they were there anyway. I sat on the edge of the bed. From the table, I had texted James Pelham 2 words, call tonight. He called at 9. He had already been thinking about it. He told me the notice to vacate Melissa used was a standard residential tenant form, the kind designed for landlords dealing with renters. It had no legal standing when directed at the property owner. In fact, under Ohio law, what Melissa had done was technically serve an eviction notice to the person who had the legal right to evict her. He said it without drama, only as a fact. I asked about the loan application. He paused and told me that if the signature on the co-applicant line was not mine, it raised a potential forgery issue. He wanted to examine the document I had photographed before saying more, but he said it mattered. I told him I had the photo. I told him I was not going to use it as a weapon. He said he knew, but she needed to know I had it. I sat with that for a while after we hung up. Then I took out a legal pad and a pen. The same pen I had used to sign that mortgage 12 years earlier, as it happened. And I started writing. Not a threat, a proposal. I was up at 6 the next morning. The house was quiet in the way houses are when everyone in them has slept badly. It was not peaceful. It was only still. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my legal pad and a mug, watching the backyard come into gray morning light. The rose canes caught the frost. One of the lavender plants had survived the season better than I expected. Daniel came downstairs at 6:30. He looked at the coffee, poured himself a cup, and sat across from me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I asked whether he had known about the loan application. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question. He shook his head and swore he had not. I looked at him. He was telling the truth. I know my son's face. I have known it since he was small enough for me to carry. I told him I believed him. He wrapped both hands around his mug and asked what I was going to do. I told him I was going to send him and Melissa a proposal with 3 options. I told him to read it, talk to a lawyer if he wanted, and then tell me which option he wanted to move toward. He started to ask if I was going to put anyone out, but he stopped before finishing the sentence. I told him no. I was not there to put anyone on the street. I never had been. He was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking up, he apologized. He did not just apologize for Thanksgiving. He apologized for a long time. I put my hand briefly on his forearm. That was enough. What I did not know until Daniel mentioned it that evening was that Melissa had come to the top of the stairs around 6:45. She had heard most of it. Then she turned around and went back to bed without saying a word. By midday, Melissa had called a lawyer. I did not learn the details of that conversation until later. Daniel told me in pieces over the following weeks, but it matters, so I will tell it straight through. The lawyer she called was not a real estate attorney. He was a friend from college who had gone into family law but occasionally handled property disputes. Melissa laid out the situation. She told him about the deed, the mortgage, the 12 years of payments, and the eviction notice. She was calm on the phone, methodical, using the version of herself she used when she needed to be taken seriously. The answer was not what she expected. He told her that if the deed was solely in my name, she had no ownership stake and no legal standing to compel me to vacate. The eviction notice she served was not only ineffective. Under Ohio landlord-tenant statutes, it could potentially be characterized as harassment of the property owner, since I had never been her tenant. He also told her that 12 years of occupying a home did not create ownership rights when the occupancy existed under an informal family arrangement rather than a documented tenancy. She argued that they had been paying utilities and maintaining the property. He told her that might be relevant to a cohabitation dispute, but it did not touch the deed. She asked about the equity. He told her that equity in property she did not own was not accessible to her. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while, the same table where 20 hours earlier she had been certain she had already won. I did not know any of that in real time. What I knew was that 3 days later, Pelham's formal letter arrived by certified mail. 2 pages. Clear and precise. Daniel had already started reading it before Melissa came downstairs. He had poured coffee and sat down alone. That was new. The following Saturday morning, Melissa knocked on my door. I had not been expecting it. I was at my desk going over paperwork, and the knock was brisk, the kind that does not truly ask permission. I told her to come in. She stood in the doorway and looked around my room for a moment. She looked at the photographs on the dresser, the narrow window, and the rose canes visible through the glass. Her expression was hard to read. It was not contempt. It was something more like recalculation. She asked what I wanted. She asked if it was money. I told her no. She asked what it was, then told me to say it. I set down my pen and told her I wanted to live in the house I had been paying for, without someone changing the locks on the garage, without being left off the guest list for my granddaughter's birthday, and without having my place in that house rewritten behind my back. I told her that whatever came next needed to have everyone's name on it, literally, in a document, with a lawyer. She said I was punishing them. I told her I was protecting myself, and that was different. She folded her arms and asked whether I knew what this was doing to her marriage. I looked at her steadily and told her I had watched that marriage from close range for 10 years, and I was not the thing straining it. She did not answer that. I told her Pelham's proposal had 3 options. All 3 were workable. All 3 left her and Daniel in the house for as long as they wanted to be there. None of them put her name on the deed, because that was not something I was in a position to give her, and she knew why. She looked at me for a long moment and asked what would happen if they did not agree to any of them. I told her we would keep talking until we did. She left without answering. I heard her steps move down the hallway, then the kitchen door, then quiet. I picked my pen back up. Outside, the last of the morning frost was melting off the rose canes, slow and steady, the way thaws always work. James Pelham's letter had arrived on a Tuesday, certified mail, so Daniel had to sign for it. He brought it inside, set it on the counter, and did not open it until Melissa was at work. I know because he called me while he was reading it. Pelham laid out the situation plainly. I was the sole legal owner of the property as recorded with the county. The notice to vacate had no legal standing when directed at the property owner. Daniel and Melissa's occupancy constituted an informal family arrangement, not a tenancy, and created no ownership rights. Then the letter presented 3 options. Option 1 was to continue the current living arrangement under a formal cohabitation agreement with written terms covering shared expenses, maintenance responsibilities, and a clear statement of my rights as property owner, including full access to all areas of the home. Option 2 was for me to transfer 50% of the deed to Daniel alone, not Melissa, on a 5-year schedule, contingent on Daniel contributing a documented monthly amount toward property costs. At the end of 5 years, assuming his contributions were current, the transfer would complete. Option 3 was for Daniel and Melissa to relocate, with me providing a one-time, no-interest loan to cover first month's rent, last month's rent, and a deposit on a rental property. Melissa's name appeared nowhere in the ownership provisions. Pelham added one additional paragraph, almost as an aside. He He noted that there was a potential legal concern regarding a signature on a financial application submitted in my name without my authorization. His office was not pursuing it at that time, but the documentation existed. Daniel read that paragraph twice, then he called me. Before I could say anything, he told me he wanted option 2. It was the first decision he had made about that house in years without checking with Melissa first. Carol Brandt called me on a Thursday about a week after the letter arrived. I almost did not pick up. I did not know which version of the conversation I was going to get. She apologized simply, without theatrics. She said she had spoken to Melissa and had told her daughter the same thing. What happened at that Thanksgiving table was not something she could support. Carol told me Melissa was her daughter and she loved her, but she and Frank had been sitting right there. They had seen what was in that envelope. I thanked her. We talked for about 10 minutes. She asked about Lily, about Daniel, and about how things were settling. I told her we were working through it. What I did not tell her was what Daniel had described to me a few days earlier. Melissa had called her mother the day after reading Pelham's letter. She explained the situation in her own version and waited for Carol to tell her she was right, that I was being unreasonable, that family loyalty required taking her side. Carol had been quiet for a long time. Then she told Melissa she had handed a man an eviction notice for his own house in front of everyone, and that she could not stand behind that. Melissa hung up. I will not pretend that felt good exactly. Melissa was not a villain in a story I had written. She was a woman who had made a series of bad decisions driven by something. Maybe ambition, maybe fear, maybe a decade of believing no one would ever push back. Now she was learning that the world did not actually bend that way. What I felt more than satisfaction was tired. Under the tiredness, there was something that had been locked away for a long time. A small, stubborn sense of relief. 2 nights after Carol's call, Daniel phoned me from his car. I could hear the engine running, but there was no movement. He had either pulled over somewhere or was sitting in a parking lot. I did not ask. He apologized again. He said not just for Thanksgiving, but for a long time before that. I told him he did not have to apologize for things Melissa had done. He said he was not. He was apologizing for what he had not done. He brought up the garage code. He brought up Lily's birthday. He said every time something happened, he told me it was not a big deal. He told me we were misreading it. Then he admitted that he knew we were not. I did not say anything to that. He said he had told himself that keeping the peace at home was protecting me. That if he smoothed things over, nothing would escalate. But really, he had been protecting himself from having to have an uncomfortable conversation. I told him I knew, because I had done that too. He signed on to option 2 that week. He told Melissa afterward, not before. She was not happy, but she sat with the letter, read it again, and eventually came back to Daniel with a counterproposal on the cohabitation terms. There were small adjustments to the shared expense structure, a couple of things about maintenance, and to my surprise, they were reasonable asks. We could work with them. People are more complicated than the worst moments they create. I am not saying everything was fixed. A lot of things were not. But that night, in my small room, I wrote in my journal again. Not the one sentence from the week before, but several pages. Sandra would have said that people can surprise you. I think she would have been right. It did not go smoothly all the way. Nothing like this ever does. The week after Daniel told Melissa about option 2, she threatened to file for divorce. She told him that if he was not willing to fight for the house and push me into transferring full ownership, then she wanted out. She made it clear that in a divorce, she would pursue primary custody of Lily. Daniel told me this on a Sunday morning while we stood in the backyard near Sandra's roses. The sky was low and white. I let him finish. Then I told him that was between him and Melissa, and it had to be. He said she was using Lily. I told him I knew. I looked at the rose canes and told him I could not change my decision because of that threat, and I did not think he should change his either. He asked what would happen if she actually filed. I told him he would get attorneys involved and work through it the way those things get worked through. Then I turned to look at him and told him Lily would always have her grandfather, wherever she was, whatever happened. That part did not move. He nodded slowly. As it turned out, Melissa did not file. She went back to her friend in family law and walked through the divorce scenario in detail. He told her what she needed to hear. In a divorce proceeding, she would have no claim on a property that did not appear in either her name or Daniel's name. The deed situation actually worked against her custody leverage play, not for it. By the end of the week, she dropped the threat. Instead, she came to Daniel with the counterproposal on the cohabitation terms. That told me something about her. It was not flattering exactly, but it was real. She was adaptable. She had finally read the room and adjusted. I could work with that. By February, the cohabitation agreement was signed. It was 2 pages and witnessed by Pelham. It covered 5 things: my right to full access to every area of the property, including the garage, a schedule for shared utility contributions, a maintenance protocol we all agreed to, a note acknowledging that I was the legal owner, and a line confirming that Daniel was working toward option 2 on his own recognizance. Melissa and I did not frame a copy for the wall. We became polite, civil. In the way, civil sometimes means two people have accepted that warmth is not available, but coexistence is. That was enough. It was more than we had before. The first Saturday in February, I was in the backyard checking the roses and tying back a few canes that had come loose from the fence in the wind. Lily came through the back door in her coat and boots and asked if she could help. I told her she could and asked her to hand me one of the ties. She did. She watched closely as I looped it around a cane. She asked why the roses needed ties. I told her it was so they would not fall over in the wind. She thought about that and said it was kind of like holding hands. I told her it was. We worked out there for 40 minutes. She asked me 7 questions about roses, including whether they could talk to each other. I told her there was actually some science suggesting plants could communicate, and that Sandra would have loved knowing that. Lily asked who Sandra was. I told her Sandra was her grandmother, and that she had planted those roses. Lily looked at the bare canes for a long moment. Then she took off her mitten and touched one carefully with the tips of her fingers. That was the best moment I had experienced in a long time. I have had time to think about all of it now, and I want to say something honestly. I was quiet for too long. For 12 years, I paid that mortgage. For 4 years, I watched the rules of my own house change around me, the garage code, the birthday party, the way Melissa would say their house and their home to people who did not know better. I let it go every time. I told myself it was not worth the fight. I told myself love was supposed to be patient, and that patience was the same as strength. It is not. Patience without limits is just a slow way of disappearing. I do not hate Melissa for what she did. I think she looked at a situation, saw an opportunity, and took it, the way ambitious people sometimes do before they fully think through the consequences. I think Daniel stayed quiet for years because conflict in the present always feels worse than erosion over time, until it does not anymore. I think my family, all of us, spent too long pretending that quiet was the same as fine. And I think I stayed quiet because I did not want to be the thing that broke something my son needed. Even after Sandra died, even after the garage code changed, even after I missed Lily's 4th birthday. At some point, the question is not whether you love your family. You do. The question is whether love without honesty is actually love, or only a very convincing imitation of it. The roses are coming back. February is early, but I can see the buds starting. Sandra always said they came back no matter what happened to them, as long as you did not give up on the soil. I think she was talking about more than roses. A few things wrapped up in the months that followed, and I want to tell how they landed. The loan application, the one with the signature that was not mine, was reviewed by Pelham. He compared it to the photo I had taken, and confirmed that the handwriting did not match my signature on file. He flagged it, documented it, and then set it aside. The bank had rejected the application before any funds moved. No harm had been completed in the financial sense. I told Pelham not to take it further, not because I had fully forgiven it. I have not entirely forgiven it, and I would be lying if I said I had. But the point was never to destroy Melissa. The point was to still be in my house. That part was settled. Carol Brandt sends me a card at Christmas now. Nothing elaborate, just a card. Frank nods when he sees me, a specific nod that says more than it shows. That is its own kind of peace. Gary and I still play golf on Wednesdays. He does not bring up Thanksgiving unless I do. When I do bring it up, he listens, says something short and reasonable, and then we move on. That is 30 years of friendship. Some things do not need much said about them. Daniel and Melissa started seeing a marriage counselor in January. I do not know the details, and I do not ask. That is their work to do. What I know is that Daniel has dinner with me in the backyard on Sunday evenings when the weather allows. Just the two of us. The way we used to before the years became complicated. Last month, I started writing down the story of this house. Not this version, but the whole story from the beginning. Sandra's idea for the roses, the first mortgage payment, the closing day when Gary shook my hand in the driveway and told me I had done right. I think Sandra would say that now too. And that is where I will leave it. If this story means something to you, if you have ever been in a room where you felt invisible in your own life, or if you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, I want you to know I understand. I was Trevor Walcott, the man Melissa tried to remove from a house she never owned. But by the end, I was also the man who finally remembered that silence is not always kindness, patience is not always strength, and love does not require you to disappear inside your own home.